Great. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's session, How an Incident Response Plan Can Save Your Business from Ransomware. I'm Don Jennings, the Senior Director of Global Communications and PR at HYCU, and I'll be moderating our session today. Our panelists are Randy Kerns, Senior Strategist and Analyst at Evaluator Group. Randy, you and I obviously go way back and have known each other for a number of years, but why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself for those that are dialing in today?
Sure. Thanks, Don. This is Randy Kerns. I do a lot of work with our IT clients, typically larger and government agencies, and they're around projects trying to solve their problems and a strategy to go forward. Protection from ransomware and data recovery and basically cyber resiliency is part of that, as well as solving larger storage strategy issues. So it's a very interesting business that I work in today with all of the excitement. That's probably an understated word around the attacks that have been happening today. So a lot of urgency. It's very interesting work.
Awesome. Thanks, Randy. And Dave Byers, Senior Field Technologist here at HYCU. Dave, why don't you introduce yourself for everybody?
Sure. So as Don said, I'm a Senior Field Technologist here at HYCU. Before that, I spent 17 years in data management with various data management organizations. Prior to that, I actually worked for a large hedge fund responsible for a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund business that managed lots and lots of people's assets. And the big part for that organization was all about the recovery, because every minute of downtime for them cost tons of money. So when I got into becoming an SE for the past 17 years, I've learned quite a bit around disaster recovery and ransomware recovery.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. And before we get started today, just a few logistics. For those that are dialing in, if you have questions, feel free to share them in the questions tab. You'll see that in the lower right-hand corner. And we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. And for those that we don't have time for, we'll definitely make sure to follow up afterwards. So I guess without further ado, guys, let's get started. Randy, you mentioned it. It's hard to open up a web browser today without seeing some sort of attack, ransomware attack, or some sort of issue with cybersecurity. And with ransomware and other cyber attacks being so commonplace, many companies are becoming numb to the threat. In fact, I think Cisco found that 42% of customers in a survey they conducted recently suffered from what they call cyber fatigue, or an apathy to proactively defend against cyber attacks. Why do you think there's such an apathy, and even worse, why is there such a risk, and how do you create a culture and instill processes that help counteract that?
Well, I'll go first. It's you're right about I don't know if it's apathy as much as frustrations of having to continually deal with it. And the biggest problem is that it's an evolving threat situation, so things continue to change. You don't just do something once and you're done. It's a continual monitoring, evolving, changing, strategizing around how to protect yourself. That does wear on you. That's part of it. The second part is it's typically inside different organizations, a disseminated group, if you will, or task amongst several people, not in the same group that's responsible. So you have network guys, you have a CISO that may be overseeing it, you have the guys doing data protection that are the last bastion to recover from these problems, and all these things have to be coordinated. So it's extra work for all of them in addition to what they're normally doing. So that's why you hear it as frustration, you hear it as maybe it's represented as fatigue, but it's just an ongoing threat situation.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and I see it as the threat landscape is constantly changing. It's not a static environment.
Mm-hmm.
The threats are ever changing. I think some of the apathy too is when organizations look at what they have to do around protect themselves around cyber threats, is that it can be very complex and daunting for some of them. So instead of really facing it head on and working towards that solution and documentation and process control, some people are kind of just don't want to look at it. It's a blind eye. They've got a really good handle on disaster recovery, but when it comes to cyber threats, I think for them it becomes a little bit more daunting, and they realize it takes a lot of time.
Understood. So I guess to the two of you, what are you hearing or seeing in the field with customers that are, at least and Randy, with companies that you work with when it comes to ransomware protection in particular? Where are you seeing customers struggle in their approach, and is it a question of identifying the threats, detecting them, or in the response of the attack, or even in the recovery itself?
That's an interesting question, because when I work with companies, the first thing I have to do is kind of educate them and say, let's break this down into different segments. And you have the things of saying, what prevention are you going to do? What are your preventative measures you can take? Where do they lie? And then you've got, like you mentioned, the detection. Where does this happen? And how do you detect it? How do you limit the damage? And then you get to the next part, how do you recover from it? And the recovery is where you really rely on very knowledgeable people and all the other practices that you've instituted. But for everyone, understanding the breakdown of the way you attack this has to be the first step. And unfortunately, those that are outside of the domain of expertise, meaning they're not inside the IT operations area effectively, they may not get that delineation, and that's a problem. So they have to understand it themselves. Then they have to continually educate those outside of their group in the company and say, this is what we're doing and this is what it means. Because they're at some point, they're going to have to defend themselves saying, this is what we did.
Gotcha. So what do you think, Dave? Anything to add?
Yeah, so exactly what Randy had said. To me, it's all about the documentation. When I work with this hedge fund, we had to assign a dollar amount for every minute of downtime. And it was extremely costly. Even though we could say, hey, we're at 99.5% uptime, that 0.5 still was a lot of money. So really, we know organizations already have tools that can identify those threats and detect what's actually happening. They might even have some third-party tools that they actually use to help them with those things. But when it comes to that response to an attack, like Randy said, they have to get a lot of people engaged. It's the backup team who's that front line who actually provides that response to recover from that.
Interesting. So if you were to break down, each of you were to break down the risk of cyber threats, and let's say like ransomware, and talk about creating a specific response, can you help make the threat feel less pervasive and make it seem more manageable? What's one way to accomplish that? And and what's your thoughts on a ransomware incident response plan in general?
Let me rewind us a second. And kind of go back to your first thing you talked about. There are a number of people that view it initially as saying, well, this is just like a disaster. This is a disaster. And it's not. It's quite different. And that's one of the things they need to understand early on. You can't just say it's a disaster, we're going to go through our disaster recovery plan, because there's a lot of assessment of, where did the problem occur? When was it introduced? Can you recover it? Do you have an isolated recovery area and then you can prove that? All those things have to go in there, which you don't do normally in a disaster response plan. One of the other things is that, and this sounds bad, but when there's an attack, typically for ransomware, you're getting help you don't need. So there's a lot of people standing there want the help, and certainly wanting status. Whereas the disaster, that's typically who's available is doing the recovery, because normally there's the families and other things that are affected during a natural disaster of some type. So they're quite different. So for the response or response plan to an attack, whether it's ransomware, denial of service, something like that, you need to have a completely different strategy around that. And you want to have a plan that you exercise probably as much or maybe more than your DR plan, so that you know how to deal with it. So that's really part of it, is develop the plan independent of the DR plan. There may be some elements you can use, or maybe a starting point to think about. That's great, but it's got to be different. David's probably got some better thoughts. He's done some work in this area. So, Dave?
Yeah, so for me, it's all about practice. And Don and Randy, I'll speak a little bit about what we've developed here at HYCU called R-Score. But when I do these assessments using R-Score, the organizations I speak to are really good about practicing disaster recovery. They tell me, hey, I've got all the documentation. We practice it every quarter or every 6 months, and they do it. But when we talk about incident response and preparing for a cyber threat, that's where some organizations say, what is an incident response? I have no idea what that is. and they think their disaster recovery plans are good enough. But when you think about disaster recovery was made for what? Oh, I deleted a file, or I modified a file. I need to roll back to a previous point in time. I've got a server that blue screens, or I've got a VM that has gone offline. I need to rebuild it really quick. So disaster recovery is really good for that. But if you think about a cyber threat, do you want to go back to the latest snapshot, or is it available? Is it encrypted? So that's where you kind of have to throw that DR plan, not totally out of the window, but you have to really rely upon an incident response plan, which really deals with dealing with cyber threats, doing analysis to find out when the cyber threat had started, and when can I roll back to a specific point in time to get my data back. So all of those things really make up a good incident response plan. But it's really educating organizations on what is an incident response plan and why is it important to me.
So just out of curiosity, where do you guys see the education coming from? Like, who leads that the sort of, who's the key educator when it comes to an incident response plan, and how do you sort of delineate between what you're doing for classic DR and now how you need to start thinking and sort of educating internal folks about not just the importance of an incident response plan, but as you mentioned, but both of you guys mentioned the differences between each, and then sort of what's the best way to effectively roll it out?
Well, you're dealing with a little bit of Newton's law when you start talking about organizations here. They tend to not want to take on extra tasks, extra work. They're busy and everything. And having somebody in from, let's say, a CISO that may not be in the chain of command through the CIO, but sometimes they aren't effective in jumping up and down and screaming, etc. So normally what I see companies is to bring somebody in from the outside to evaluate whether they are prepared or not. They may become change agents, but more importantly, they're the ones that are running down the hallways with gasoline and saying, there's going to be somebody chasing me with a match. You guys better do this. So the idea is that you get them excited saying, you need to do something. And then you give them some guidance about what needs to be done. And at least that gets them the awareness and the sense of urgency there. Because if there's not somebody pointing out the problem, typically the sense of urgency won't happen. That's why you really want to get an independent set of eyes and things. Dave referred to the R score. That's a perfect pretext for having a discussion about are we really prepared or not. That's one thing to start, but you have to have somebody that all the way up and down the line, from the CIO, even the CEO on down, saying, you're not prepared. You need to address this. Dave?
Yeah, and I also see organizations that have either internal auditors or third-party auditors. I am seeing more and more of these internal auditors and third-party auditors are kind of bringing to the table, not just on the recovery from a lost file, but the recovery from a cyber threat. And I think it's the auditors that are kind of raising that up to a higher level, to the CTO level, to knowing they have to do something about this. And one of the places I really tell people to go to is NIST. And if someone wants to look at it, just go to nist.gov, but that is the National Institute of Standards of Technology. This is a really good starting place to go to, but there is a framework that NIST has developed, and that framework talks about how to deal with ransomware events, and also talking about incident response plans, how to develop those, and how to build a really nice, robust framework for that organization. Really good place to go.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's super helpful, guys. Before we carry on, just a couple quick questions that are coming from the audience. I think would be a good point in time now to take these. So somebody's asking, our company requires us to have a robust DR documentation and practice DR drills. Is that good enough to recover from a cyber threat, or what more should we be thinking about?
Yeah, Randy, I'll take this one. I kind of alluded to the answer to this already. Like I said, a lot of organizations do have that disaster recovery documentation built already. It is different because, like I said, if you have that file that's been deleted, I need to recover back. That's what disaster recovery is good for. Incident response, we also talk about immutable storage. And when I build an incident response plan, people sometimes also think, hey, because I'm using immutable storage, isn't that good enough? I'm like, like your disaster recovery and your immutable storage, though immutable storage is good and it's part of a really good disaster recovery plan, it is not always necessarily good if I don't have a really good incident response plan developed and built that I can rely upon it. And you need to practice this too. You need to practice it and have that muscle memory to give you confidence in knowing that if I run up against a cyber threat, I have the confidence in not just the sysadmins, but also the team around me to support that when I have that event. So incident response plans are different, but they're custom tailored to making sure if I have any type of a cyber threat, that we know how to deal with it. It's fully documented, and now we know how to do it because we practiced it. And like DR plans, documentation, practice, practice, practice. At least do them quarterly.
Yeah, understood. Hey, I know both, another question that just came in from the audience. Both Randy, you've mentioned this, and Dave, you mentioned it as well earlier. What is our score exactly, and where do I go to get more information?
Well, okay, quickly. David said the key word earlier about audit. A regular audit is happening more frequently, but the audits are sometimes not done by people who are practitioners. Mm-hmm. And so that is a really big deal. So you really want to have something where the people that are intimately involved with the process and doing the work understand where their shortcomings are. So our score is I'll let Dave describe it, but it's a vehicle really for those people to see whether or not they really measure up. Have they addressed these issues? And it's a great point to start that conversation saying, okay, we did poorly here in this self-audit, if you will. Mm-hmm. We need to do this. And that starts the conversation. Now, Dave, why don't you talk a little bit more about our score then?
So, as I alluded to, our score is an assessment. The assessment is 98 questions across 5 different categories. The assessment really gives an organization an understanding of how prepared they are to recover from a ransomware type threat. Mm-hmm. It actually provides them with a score, and that score is going to give them that baseline of where they stand today. When I do this with organizations, they realize that the score they get is not as high as they like it to be on first attempt. Mm-hmm. But I'll tell you what, it's very eye-opening when people walk through this, and everyone that I've done these assessments for, they're like, thank you so much for letting me do this, because I had no idea about this, or this. And typically in sections 4 and 5, that's where I see a lot of people who don't have, the necessary controls that are built in place to help them get to that, or even have like an auditing team that might be a third party or internal. Sometimes I tell them, well, you yourself have to be that auditor to make sure you do these certain things. So our score, I think, is really eye-opening for a lot of organizations. Here at HYCU, we actually took 6 months to develop this tool. And Randy, you actually evaluated that tool too, right?
I did. And like I say, you hit the nail on the head. It brings up the questions that the people doing it need to answer, or at least be honest with and understand what they've done. And an external audit by somebody who's not intimate with the way companies work probably won't ask all the correct questions or know where to look, which rocks to turn over, so to speak. And that's why our score, being done like David's talking about, interactively with people, is a great tool.
Yeah. So you guys are teasing me. Where do I get it?
It's really getourScore.org. Very simple.
Gotcha. Fair point. Just really just a couple more questions, and then I certainly appreciate your guys' time and insight into sort of what's going on with the threat landscape and sort of ways to address it. So what advice would you give to teams that are looking to implement an incident response plan? If you don't already have one in place, what's a first step in that process? And then sort of what would you, how would you counsel rolling it out? I know the importance of having an objective third party come in and help and sort of look at things as well. A few things that we've addressed, but sort of where would you get started if one doesn't exist?
Let's let Dave go first this time, rather than me stealing his thunder all the time.
And I mentioned this too already, but it's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. That site is really easy to get to also. It's just simple, nist.gov /cyber framework. And for me, when I look at the NIST, when I built or helped develop our score, what I did is I actually went to NIST and I wanted to find out what they were saying around incident response. So a lot of the things that I had put inside of our score was helped develop not just by what HYCU thought was a good question to put in our score, but we wanted to build this on industry best practices. Some of the industry best practices that I think is very valuable would be the NIST.gov cyber framework. Go there and take a look, because there's a wealth of information and guidance on how to actually build these incident response plans and also develop a framework for your organization.
Awesome. Perfect.
I think that's great. There's one more thing that about somewhat the way I work. Certainly you need that background knowledge, and that's a great way to start. But then you have to do some what if scenarios. You come up with several what ifs and say, with what you have today, how would you do this? And this is for a group to be in a room working through these things. You let them self-identify their shortcomings. And once they start to roll on this and say, well, wait a minute, we're not doing that and everything, all of a sudden the ugly little things start to come out in those discussions. Then you can say, okay, well, now let's look at this framework. So you educate yourself's background. You do the discussion where you really bring out, what are the shortcomings, but you have to get people to buy in. And you do that in a discussion where it's a positive thing. They're not being subject to an audit, which has a huge set of negative connotations to it. But you do that in a working session, and then you say, okay, now that we've just done this, let's start putting something together. And then you go through and start working through these frameworks, and then you tick off all the things that you identified as shortcomings. Have we covered these? What did we miss? And it becomes its own little group project, if you will, at least getting the planning done for it, which is what Dave was referring to.
And it's also, once you create this, it's a living document, because if you think about an organization's infrastructure, it's not stagnant, it's constantly changing. And even if they're making updates and changes to that infrastructure, they need to go back and test again with your incident response. So as I change the infrastructure, I better go and do like a disaster recovery test and also an incident response, making sure my documentation is now completely up to date based upon those infrastructure changes that our organization has made.
Awesome. Well, I know we're coming up on a hard stop, and I know you guys are both extremely busy, so really appreciate your time. Randy, for those that want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Just give me your home phone number, Don, and you know how to get hold. No, we're at evaluatorgroup.com. And you can just send emails to randy@evaluatorgroup.com. I try to answer all of them. Phone calls, not so much.
I hear you. Dave, what about you?
And it's just real simple, david.byers@hycu.com. Awesome.
Well, thank you so much. As I said, I appreciate your guys' time, and for those that dialed in today. For those questions that we couldn't get to, we absolutely will be following up shortly or in the not too distant future. Again, appreciate your guys' time. Thank you so much. And if you have questions about our score, ransomware preparedness, creating and cultivating an incident response plan that's effective in today's cyber resiliency and cyber attack situations, by all means, I know Randy would be more than happy to field those questions and help you, as would we. So thanks, everybody, and enjoy your day.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.